a new thing for the organisation to have internally. And so I wanted to share some ideas about the ways in which we can set ourselves up, the ways in which we can work, the ways in which, as a team, we can do some small things, make some small changes to create environments that not only breed good design, but breed good design that is commercially successful. Because I echo a lot of the things that you already heard today, that design and optimization, they are in many ways conjoined, and in many ways they should be married together. But it's not always the case, and you'll find that in lots of organisations they are splitting apart. And there's some things that we can do. There's some small changes that I think we can do, from my experience, that can have a big effect. So my presentation is called The Flight Path to Successful Design. It's called that, one, because I love airline puns and I have a lot of opportunity to do that, and two, because this is kind of a map for you guys. It's kind of just some things that I've learned, some things that I've experienced along the way that I wanted to share with you, and perhaps you'll have some success in applying some of these things. It gets a bit preachy in the middle, I'll warn you now. I'm trying not to be a rant about this. I'm not going to call people out, because we've already seen some airlines getting a kicking today. Sort of easy target, but I'm going to try and avoid that for the sake of my job. The subject of conversion rate optimization, it's something that's very close to my heart, and I think that's sort of a strange thing for someone from a design background to say, but I think it can be done better, and I think it can be done in a way that is much more principled and much more aligned to where your company is trying to go. But the environments that we as designers, content specialists, researchers, whatever you want to call yourselves, we create is not often conducive to that kind of work. So you might have seen these sorts of diagrams before. They're coming more and more common. They're sort of waved around in our faces, and we're always told to go for the sweet spot. We're always told to kind of go for the overlap. I hate these diagrams. I hate them. I don't hate the type of diagram. John Ben's done some very wonderful work. But I hate the inference that these two things are separated. Right? And we do this a lot, and we do it to ourselves. And it's only a small thing. It's just a diagram shouldn't seem so harmful, but what's underneath it, I think, is quite damaging. And what's underneath it, and the things that we say, I think it perpetuates some bad behaviour. This one is even worse. I mean, Jesus Christ, what's happening over here? What is this company doing? What are these businesses doing over this side that's so dark and such covered in subterfuge, that it's so far from the user's needs? I mean, the user's need. We're the users, right? We're all people. This is the people in the world, and here's the things that we need to keep us happy and comfortable. And there's some horrible shit over here, and I don't know what that is. And it terrifies me, and I these are the kinds of things that I'm trying to avoid, and just changing the language around this, I think, is very important. And if you have one of these diagrams in your department, if someone has got a presentation in your team, I recommend that you can challenge them on this, because I think these are very bad things. Fundamentally, design is problem solving. I think we can all agree on that, right? Design is about problem solving, and if the problem is not here or here, then I just don't know what the hell you've made. And as we heard right at the start, if it's not solving the problem, it's not done, it's not finished. And the use of these diagrams and this kind of language that we use around these kinds of conversations, where you separate up a delivery or a design or a piece of work from optimization, that only is going to lead us into some pretty awful places. That's going to lead us into the kinds of things that Chris and Tony were describing at the start, where you have one team who delivers something, and then you have another team who optimizes it. And then, from my experience, there's very little chance of that team who are optimizing it ever truly understanding what the purpose was of that design, what the path was of that design. And if you've ever been in one of those teams where you deliver something and someone else optimizes it, that really hurts. And I can tell you, if someone starts coming at you with the term growth hacking, you all know what rage looks like. There's nothing more heartbreaking than someone trying to growth hack your work. It's horrible, and it makes me very, very uncomfortable. And I don't think it should be necessary. So, good design and good business, fundamentally they're the same thing, right? If you're designing something well, if you're creating good work, it will sell. And that's, I appreciate that that's quite a tough thing to sometimes communicate within a business. Sometimes, you'll find these kinds of organisations that see that small overlap as an okay thing, and they don't necessarily align design or the delivery of a user experience with the business, with commercial realities, and that's kind of a pretty dangerous place to get into. But as a community, as a group, as practitioners, there are some ways through this, and it can be just simple changes in language, and it can be demonstrating how other organisations have applied this and have been successful in it. So you can look around and you can see there is a number of brands out there who are doing good design, who are applying good design. And the thing that you should bear in mind is that these organisations, they haven't invented anything. I don't want to do any of these brands a disservice. They're all doing incredible things. But before Twitter, there were social media platforms. Before Monzo, there was online banks. Before Deliveroo, before Spotify, before Virgin Atlantic, there was Transatlantic. They're not creating new things, they're just designing things better. It's the bottom line. That's why they're successful, is because they're designing things, they're creating things in a more user-centric way, they're delivering faster, and they're putting design up higher in their organisation, and they're seeing the success of it. And so you can use these brands, you can use these organisations, and there's a lot of information out there in the further reaches of the internet about how these organisations are structured. And lots of them are run, and the design and product teams are run by very nice people, and they don't take my word for it. You can just reach out to a lot of these and they will tell you how they run and how they work and how they operate, and that's the sort of thing that we can take and feed back into our organisations. And so there's lots of examples like this, but you will still find inevitably people from sales or commercial or marketing backgrounds kind of raising criticism at these. Twitter is an incredible platform, a perfect example, and Spotify as well. They've been running for a number of years. They're huge networks. They have valleys worth of data, and they've never turned a profit. Twitter is entirely propped up on investment and nothing else. So inevitably you might get some pushback, and maybe some people will criticise some of these brands if you try and use them as examples. But it's a pretty simplistic response to that if you need to. Look, if you've seen the news lately, Apple are on the verge of becoming the world's first $1 trillion company. I think just for a minute, let's stop and appreciate what that means. It's not an oil company, it's not a financial service company, it's not a car company. And again, Apple, not to do them a disservice, but they don't invent anything. Right? There was touchscreen phones before Apple. There was online music stores before Apple. There was laptops before Apple. They just design it better, right? And they're on the verge of becoming the world's first $1 trillion company. As far as I'm concerned, the conversation around should you invest in design and can design be a differentiator, 2018, that conversation is over. That isn't something you should be struggling to articulate anymore. These are big, powerful statements that these organisations have made, and Apple, they've changed that conversation, and they've proved that point on a scale that is now just beyond refute. It's beyond measure, and it will probably be historic past our lifetimes anyway. So if we can agree that commercial success and well-designed products are not necessarily separate things that overlap one another, then perhaps thinking about them as a single element, a single entity that is on a gradient may be more successful. And I think that's probably a more fruitful way of finding this. And this is a very simple, straightforward methodology that you can use within your organisations to help define something that is more fruitful. So if you look at this as a gradient, and perhaps down one end you could have a more passive approach to design, whereby you're not chasing after numbers and you're doing a lot of brand work and you're letting customers come to you. And then that would mean the further end of the scale would be something more aggressive. I don't know, maybe aggressive is not the right word, that sounds a bit unpleasant. But so down this end you will find the long game. This is where you will need to invest a lot of time in your brand. This is where you will need to do a lot of work on your reputation. Down this end you will find some pretty immediate data. This is where you'll kind of get some immediate KPIs here. But as we heard earlier, and as Tony pointed out, that's going to be a short-term game. And then the matter then simply becomes an exercise in determining where you or your brand or your organisation or your product sits within that. And that can be connected to business strategy, maybe that can be connected to brand strategy, but once you've found your place on that and you can get people to appreciate and understand that, and perhaps you can use examples and say, well, down this end is a blue and yellow airline, and then down this end is someone else, like Spotify, for example, and you can use those gradients and plot your place within it. You can put that in your office, you can make that more visible, and then people will start to have a common language with you when you're designing your user experiences, or you're writing or you're researching your user experiences. And so just to illustrate that point, if you're creating an e-commerce experience, you can then reference perhaps a retail experience. So here we have TK Maxx this side, and this one we have, I can't remember what this is, I think this was Chanel. And so they're both selling clothes, right? There's a t-shirt in there, there's a t-shirt in there, there's a dress in there, there's a dress in there. These are fundamentally the same product. Fundamentally, that's the same service. Right? You walk into a building, it has a door, there's a product, you pick it, you try it on maybe, you pay for it, you walk out the store. That's the same experience, but they are designed in very, very different ways. On the right-hand side, there's lots of price messages in there, there's an awful lot of choice all at once. There's just a lot going on in there. And this one, this chairs and tables are encouraging you just to sit around and drink coffee and look amazing. And there's very little in terms of product. I would imagine there's not any prices anywhere in there. And both are okay, but neither of them are bad design necessarily, but they are in their right places on that gradient. So they're able to say, okay, we're TK Maxx, this is where we belong, this is how we behave. The designers get behind that, the marketing team gets behind that, the commercial team gets behind that, etc., etc. Both have their benefits, both have their downsides perhaps, but they have found their place within that gradient. And so that kind of simple exercise of saying, forget about the Venn diagrams, forget about the separate things, and think of this as a gradient. That simple exercise can be enormously powerful for you as designers or content people or whomever. Whoa. So that was a lot of abstract stuff. So this. In this next part, I thought maybe I'll just share some ways. If you've found your place on that scale and you've gone through that exercise and you've got people to buy into that, or maybe they don't buy into it, so you do it by yourself and then it's there and it's illustrated. What can you do to ensure that you are set up in a way that your team or yourself you're in a position whereby you can create something that is not only successful as a piece of design in terms of meeting the user's needs, but it's successful in piece of design in terms of being commercially valuable and hitting the KPIs or the measurements or whatever it is that your business is chasing. So this is going to be some tools and some methods for you to find out where you sit on that scale. Perhaps are you being too passive, are you being too aggressive, and recognising that at certain points, maybe sales times or when things are not going the way they're supposed to, maybe that needle needs to move a little bit. So here's the practical stuff. Number one, so you can structure yourself for continuous improvement. So if you structure yourself, and I don't mean you have to change and do a big restructure and a reorg and get HR involved and it all gets horrible. I mean just setting your team up in a working method that is pointing towards continuous improvement, these sorts of things will start to roll out by themselves. And you can do things like so creating a North Star or a beacon for each product team or each area or each client or brand or whatever you work on. And that can be a prototype, that can be a film, that can be storyboards, whatever. If you say to that team, design me the perfect version of what you're doing. Forget about money, forget about technology. What's the thing that we're all aiming for? If you have that in your back pocket, or if you have that there, then everyone can find a way of working towards something and recognizing where they are today versus where they want to be. And I would strongly recommend that that's something that you make and you create that as a project, because if someone can see it and if they can poke it and if they can look at it and understand it, then they can get behind it. If you're just trying to describe something and saying, oh, it should be all cool and shit and a bit like Apple, people are never going to really fully invest in that. Regardless if you're doing agile or waterfall or some horrible combination that may be thrown in there with a terrible name, always describe your designs, always describe your deliveries in phases. Always talk about, well, this is the first instance of what we're doing, because as soon as you frame it in that way, as soon as you frame it around those kinds of stepped changes, people will start to realise that it's not just a case of, well, we did the website, now we're all cool for a month. No, it's not like that at all. And inevitably along the way, you're going to be trimming things out to hit your minimum viable product, but never ever lose sight of those ideas. On the path to creating anything, inevitably there'll be lots of good stuff. And maybe it's not practical at the time, or maybe it's a bit too expensive, or maybe it's just a bit untested, or maybe it's not quite right for the brand. But if you capture all of those, and again, keep them visible in your office, keep them on boards, keep them on the walls, keep them up next to these kinds of things, that kind of stuff, the language that you use around that will start to change people's minds and start to move people back to the point where they're thinking about design and commercial success in one single continuum. Adopt yourself a toolkit for persuasive design, and this is really going to come down to each individual here to determine how far you want to go with these things. Today, in Tony's talk, he's had some really good examples. Good examples, maybe bad examples of how people have applied these kinds of things. Persuasive design, this is a whole presentation itself. I'm not going to go into all the details of each of these, but if you can have a look at some of the techniques that are out there and start to think ahead of how you would apply some of these things to your product, to your brand, you can start to have a toolkit for when that pressure comes down, to understand what's the right response. If someone is saying to you, we really need to drive the value of sale or volume of sales, you need to know how to respond in an appropriate way. So you can apply techniques like scarcity, so sort of saying, well, telling people if an offer ends at a certain time, or telling people if there's a volume of product that is dwindling. Social proofing, so saying, well, 90% of people in your area bought this, or people like you bought this, etc., etc. Anchoring bias, so giving people a point from which to make their decisions, a jump-off point. Sometimes that's a price, sometimes that's a timeline, etc., etc. Finding a common language. That's content design. I won't go into that because Rachel deals with that kind of stuff. And simplification, as we saw, sort of stripping out the unnecessary. All of these things are very, very powerful in themselves as individual techniques. But I would strongly advise that each of us take some time to understand what these are, understand how they work, and even if they're just sketches, even if they're kind of rough prototypes of how you would apply these things into your world, knowing them up front and understanding how you would apply them up front is so much more powerful than trying to defend against someone who wants to do it in a shitty way. Again, this is UX principles, design principles, that's a whole other talk in itself. But this is something else that you can do. It's relatively a lightweight piece of work. You don't need to invest in a 6-month consultancy and deep dive to create a set of principles that you hold dear to yourself. But if you can connect them back into your brand values, or if you don't have brand values, then perhaps your business metrics or your business goals or whatever it is that's driving the team who are running the company, you can connect your UX principles directly into those. You can immediately have a set of armour as a designer. These will immediately provide you with all the defence that you need against bad ideas or ideas that you don't feel comfortable with, or when people are trying to persuade you to go into a slightly different direction, or they're desperately chasing after something that a competitor is doing. If you can have those principles, again, I'm kind of, as I say this, I'm really encouraging you to litter your offices, but put these things on your walls, make them very big, stand by them, and just repeat the hell out of them. Say them over and over and over again, and they will start to stick, and people will start to think twice about when they try and drive design or product into a strange position. Quote them regularly, share them proudly. They will work for you. But if you work somewhere that doesn't have a well-defined brand, or doesn't have a well-defined set of values, start from the data. Turn it up the other way. Look at the data that you have, because if you're online, if you're doing anything digital, you can collect the data about what people are doing and use those to form your principles, at least as a start point. And then learn to tell your stories. So even if you have a small win, no matter how small it is, get the data from it, promote it, share that with people, send it round to as many people, make posters, again, just screw your office up, make posters of it, highlight the research that you've done, demonstrate the value all the way through. Even if it's the smallest thing, it will start to gain you traction. Don't worry about the fact that you may be just dining out on one great thing you did, because it will lead you to the next great thing. And learn to tell it in a way that has an impact. So if you can learn to speak your business, if you can replicate some of those terms that preoccupy your business, throw some acronyms in there, then it will start to hit home a bit more, and people will be able to relate to it much more comfortably. So if your organisation is worried about overheads, like operational overhead, start talking to them about the content overhead that they're creating with that idea. If your company is in sort of pre-investment rounds and they're worried about debt, start talking to them about the design debt for inconsistency or technical debt. Have a translator that works for you that makes these things stick. And so I always like to end with a pretentious quote, but this one I think is really important. So if you think good design is expensive, you should look at the cost of bad design. And this really relates back to what Tony was saying at the start. So I think I've quoted Tony more than anyone else in this. If someone is going to lead you into something that you don't believe is going to work, if someone is leading you into something that you feel is a bad piece of design, you may get a small blip in the numbers, but it's going to cost you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.